To better understand the current state of modern-day media manipulation, we must first look at the father of propaganda, Edward Bernays. His influence on the 20th century rivaled that of his uncles, Sigmund Freud, as Bernays pioneered the idea of crowd psychology with Freud's psychoanalytical ideas in what would become a new political ideal on how to control the masses. In his 1928 book, Propaganda, Bernays wrote, "If we understand the mechanisms and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it." He called it the engineering of consent and proposed that those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It was Bernays who introduced the corporate giants to crowd psychology methods and polished techniques to manipulate society. He convinced the population to buy on impulse things they didn't even need by linking mass-produced goods to their own unconscious desires. The tobacco industry hired Bernays to persuade women to take up smoking, and the Alcoa Aluminum Company asked him to drive the campaign for the national fluoridation of our water supply. A consumerist culture was born, and the U.S. government took notice. In addition to famous corporate giants, Bernays also began working for the federal government. They adopted his technique of manufacturing ever-present dangers and then maintaining a constant state of fear to give those in power greater control of what Bernays called the mass mind.
Hello everyone, welcome to GGN. Today is Tuesday, March 26, 2013. I'm Darko. My website's ggnonline.com, and on YouTube my channels are ddarko2012, ddarko2013. Alright, I'm going to do kind of something different today. I'm probably going to cover the same issue, which is pushing feminism and stuff and using engineer consent to do it and how it's changing society. There's lots of news that I can get to. I looked through a bunch of news articles that I collected today, but then I kind of just changed my mind to do this. So tomorrow I'll be able to cover all the other news. But it says here that Bernays and propaganda theorist Walter Lippmann were members of the U.S. government's Committee on Public Information, which successfully convinced formerly isolationist Americans to support entrance into World War I. While propaganda was commonly thought of as a negative way of manipulating the masses that should be avoided, Bernays believed it was necessary for the functioning of a society, as otherwise people would be overwhelmed with too many choices. In his own words, modern propaganda is a consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, idea, or group. He started by being hired by the American Tobacco Company to encourage women to start smoking. While men smoked cigarettes, it was not publicly acceptable for women to smoke. He staged a dramatic public display of women smoking during the Easter parade in New York City, then told the press to expect women suffragists would light up torches of freedom during the parade to show that they were equal to men. Says here, "You've come a long way, baby," like the ads were. I guess that was the buzz term. This campaign basically commodified women's progress and desire to be considered equal to men. You go in there and check it out. Links will be posted. Cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. Women would smoke because it was then that they would have their own penises. Of course, you have to think this is all Freudian stuff. So, and then you can actually see the footage and photographs. So. And here's some more background information. You go check it out. This is from John Rappaport at WordPress.com or NoMoreFakeNews.com. The Disaster of Manufacturer Consent in the Matrix. This article may seem about abstract theory, but it isn't. It's about how populations are viewed by the psychological operations specialists. It's about how people are led to accept substitutes for their own highest ideals. The substitutes look like the real thing, but they're actually very well drawn cartoons. The most successful long-term psyops are aimed at getting people to accept good things, wonderful things, except it turns out that these things magically evaporate and leave populations in the lurch. Imagine for a moment that every crisis we now find ourselves in, every form of pollution and poisoning, and every war and mass destruction of life was preceded and precipitated by a psyop, that's psychological operation, that looked like a golden destiny of fulfillment. At some point, every intelligent human develops their own reality. It isn't usually a clear, articulated, and overall position. It tends to be a hodgepodge of linked ideas, preferences, feelings, principles, and morals. Nevertheless, consciously and unconsciously, the person refers to it often and uses it as a tool with which to navigate through life. But in the matrix, there is pressure to have people connect the realities to each other, said because groups can thus be created. Groups are easier to compromise than individuals. That's what we keep hearing about, the collective conscious and mass democracy. They did this a lot in World War II, kind of like we were just looking at the smoking slogan. You know, don't you know there's a war on, and the Rosie the Riveter ones, and over there. It was to get people isolationists thinking about a war over there that they didn't even want to have anything, any part of, right? But so they have little hooks, little phrases, and these are very psychological hooks. We get the concept of hooked ideas. A hooked idea is one which will entice people to merge their realities into one. The hooked idea can be expressed as a slogan and a so-called meme, a principle. It is introduced by people who work psyops, usually advertising. It's a campaign to herd people into a place where their individual realities overlap. It has nothing to do with true progress or honest intent. It has everything to do with control. The psyop calculation runs this way. The majority of people who buy in and connect their realities to other people's realities and achieve overlap will go passive and accept a new humane society. All these people are complete pawns. In like that documentary, Propaganda, they say it's by North Korea. I'm not sure if it actually is. But they go in there into detail and talk about how in this mass democracy of consumers, as long as they have all these revolutions, as long as they don't have a social revolution, you know, it could be, I guess, a peaceful social revolution, but as long as they don't have any real social change that's by the people, grassroots, and not from the top down by think tanks and large corporations and organizations, then they don't really care, right? Like in one of the comments, someone says, well, you know, in America, in America, I'm able to at least comment on this and talk about stuff, where in North Korea they're not. And I'm like, well, what? That's because you're not a threat to the social order. You're nothing to them. They allow you to go and type on the computer because they know the majority of people think like you. They don't think for themselves. They were given their thoughts. So it says the sector of people who buy in and thus share realities collectively and then do something about it. These activists, these people will follow a prescribed path. They'll join their approved groups and campaigns for the chosen causes, yeah. It says there's a sequence at work here. First, with the development of the computer, people could search and find information. They've allowed us to do this and get hooked for a good 20 years now. Now they have computers anticipating what the desired information is and provide it. They segued with YouTube. Now these are the algorithms to see what the opposition and what people are thinking and try to create this kind of false parallels to it. Finally, people will be given quite apart from their desires to the information they require as educated by experts. I've mentioned the whole Rosie the Riveter story or concept here and there throughout my broadcast since I started in late 2009. And I've seen it in entertainment of what actually happened. And, the biggest thing about wars is that they can change society. That's one of the biggest reasons. They can gain more centralized political control over the masses, but then they can also change and tweak society the way they wanted to. This, of course, was one of them. Real-life Rosie the Riveter, feminist icon, dies at 86. This Geraldine Doyle, a woman featured in the iconic World War II era Rosie the Riveter posters that died at 86. So it turned into a symbol of women's empowerment. Rolled up sleeves, flexed right arm came to present the newfound strength. So they exploited them is what they did. And then when they were done with them, like in A League of Their Own, trust me, I love that movie, because like baseball, but it's like that's what they did to them. They dressed them up in short skirts, they took them away from their families, offered them something challenging, and like I said, they exploited them as girls, making them slide in those short-ass skirts, and then when they were done with them, they kicked them out. Like all the women in the factories, when that was done, when that was over, and the men came back, because when they came back, they wanted to keep doing what they're doing. So society was already changed. The damage was already done. Here's some research, I think that's French, the 1950s and 60s and the American women, the transition from the housewife to the feminist. It says women were searching their places in society led by men, finding ways to escape stereotypes by redefining roles and professions barriers to become a force of action and no longer simple spectators. It said here, even with all the national efforts to maintain women in their housewife role, a great many of them were finding in work a way to fulfill that life that couldn't be completed only by family life. The myth that women were unreliable and that they would quit their jobs for motherhood was more and more distant. It goes on here and it says that one of the main transformations experienced by working women was a new image that they had of themselves. They saw they could be independent and made them increasingly confident in their capacities as women and professionals. It says their salaries were sending their children to ballet and football class, to summer camp, and buying new domestic appliances that families saw on TV. After the Second World War, women's capacities and opportunities were increasingly established. So was the acceptance of American men's domestics. I don't know what the heck that means, but according to Margaret Mead, the new middle-class family is a cooperative, too self-centered unit where the father was as much a part of the home as the mother. It says the idea was usually that women could fall back on work was extremely widespread, the idea that is, and presumed that work was something that a woman would do if necessary. In reality, the kind of women that worked drastically changed after the war. Before, it was the majority of women that were a part of the working force were young and single. However, after 1945, the female workforce was twice as big, and the majority of these women were housewives. This is interesting. It says if white middle-class women could have the choice to work or stay home, black women worked outside the home by extreme necessity. It said, in fact, by 1950, 57% of black women worked outside the house, while white women doing the same were only 37%. While millions of women were forced to leave the workforce after the war, they didn't actually stop working. They were rerouted to clerical sales service jobs, teachers, nurses, sales girls. It says this high level of well-planned idea of togetherness was considered one of the main causes of divorce at the time. However, the situation where both parents were equally responsible and active in the household work was much more idealistic than real. Lastly, it says here that women were capable of amazing accomplishments and managed to begin a cultural and social transformation on the 1950s mentality about women. It says femininity was still seen as a concept that would help America establish the stereotype of the perfect family life. The feminist movement. Most Americans believe the feminist movement was begun in order to bring about the equality of the disenfranchised women. It says although working women have benefited from the movement in some ways, and all who possess a sense of fairness support those benefits, that's not the prime reason for the movement. The prime reason is to divide and conquer. It says as bizarre as it may seem, the motive behind feminism is to drive a wedge between men and women, thereby creating social conflict. It's the Marxist scheme of class warfare, and there's no doubt that the movement is led by the lesbian faction, who are the world's most fervent men-haters. Would study much of the material and scripts written for entertainers, especially those so-called female stand-up comics, degrades and degenerates men, and most of their sewer-grade comedy is sexual in nature. All too many advertisements on TV subtly downgrade men in the eyes of their wives and children. It says here, but the overwhelming majority of women have not caught on to the sinister implications of the feminist movement, even though many don't like it, and the purpose of this movement is undetected by the masses. I'll leave you with this quote here. You have not begun to appreciate the real depth of our guilt. We are intruders. We are disturbers. We are subverters. We have taken your natural world, your ideals, your destiny, and played havoc with them. We have been at the bottom not merely of the latest great war, but of all your wars, not only of the Russian, but of every other major revolution in your history. We have brought discord and confusion and frustration into your personal and public life. We are still doing it, and no one can tell how long we shall go on doing it. Please join me in part 2. This is GGN, and I'm Darko. Thank you.